Egypt is considered by many to be one of the first great civilizations, and at its prime was a true ancient superpower and a center of art, culture, and education. But Egypt was also a pretty crazy place. Lice is one of mankind's oldest companions, and in ancient Egypt, lice were literally everywhere. Nothing too strange about that. To cope with it though, the Egyptians would shave every inch of body hair they could put a sharp knife to, including all the hair on their heads. And it wasn't just the men. The women shaved their heads bald as well. The women would wear fashionable wigs that, once infested with lice, could easily be tossed away. We might think of catcalling as a modern phenomenon, but it is hardly new. The Greek historian Herodotus watched as Egyptians prepared for a religious festival in the city of Bubastis and gathered together with their families onto boats. As they cruised down the Nile, the men on the boats would jeer and shout at women, pulling up their garments to expose themselves. Much like modern catcallers, ancient Egyptian men also held on to the hope that a random catcall would woo a woman so thoroughly that she would jump straight into their arms. After swimming across a crocodile-infested river, of course. In 1922, famed Egyptologist Howard Carter discovered the long-buried and still-sealed tomb of Tutankhamun. Making a small hole, Carter stuck his head inside, as the impatient Lord Carnarvon asked him, "Can you see anything?" Carter's reply became one of the most famous quotes in history, saying, "Yes, wonderful things." A tomb filled with gold, jewels, and precious artifacts, Tutankhamun's final resting place had lain undisturbed for 3,000 years. And as glinting riches met Carter's eyes, something else did too. Something peculiar. It was Tutankhamun's erect member. Unlike any other Egyptian pharaoh discovered, King Tut was found buried with his genitalia at a 90-degree angle. Theories abound as to why, but no one knows for sure. Even more controversial is the idea some researchers have put forward that his embalmers switched his real anatomy with a more impressive specimen. Apparently size mattered, even in ancient Egypt. The ancient Egyptians weren't just skilled at working on the bodies of the dead. They were also quite advanced in the fields of medicine. For example, women had an ancient type of pregnancy test where they would moisten a sample of barley and emmer wheat with their urine every day. If the barley grew, then that meant that the woman was pregnant, and it was likely going to be a boy. And if the emmer wheat grew, then the woman was pregnant with a girl. If neither grew, then the woman wasn't pregnant. This test has actually been confirmed by modern science to be surprisingly effective. Egyptian women were often described by travelers as having a beautiful foreign mystique to them, a beauty that apparently lasted even after death. During his stay in ancient Egypt, Herodotus recorded that when the most beautiful women died, the Egyptian would allow their bodies to decay for several days before being taken to the embalmer. This had less to do with saying goodbye, and more with the fact that ancient Egyptians didn't trust their embalmers to not get overly friendly with the corpses of their dead women. Herodotus recorded that an embalmer was once caught in the act by a coworker, and thus the Egyptians decided to ensure it wouldn't happen again by making sure that their most visually pleasing women were a little overly ripe by the time they got to a potentially lonely embalmer. We've all seen pictures of ancient hieroglyphics portraying the pharaohs of Egypt as muscular and perfect specimens of humanity. After all, as the living incarnations of gods, how could they be anything short of physically perfect? Yet, the reality is far from what was portrayed on ancient walls. It turns out that the worst offenders in the fake selfie category were the pharaohs, who ordered their artists to portray them as physically perfect while often being obese. With priests ordered to prepare 3 banquets each day overflowing with meats, wine, and all manner of cakes, the pharaohs grew to rather rotund proportions. Today, their mummies have been discovered with clogged arteries, giant bellies, and huge fat folds. The Egyptians were so familiar with obesity that they produced medical texts on its danger as early as 1500 BC. Many religions around the world share similar creation myths, but ancient Egyptians have one that is almost wholly unique to them. In theirs, the world before creation was much like in the book of Genesis, a formless void without shape. Here, however, is where the similarities end, and the Egyptians take a very sharp left turn. In their creation myth, the god Atum engaged in a little self-love and gave birth to a twin pair of gods by spitting them out of his mouth, and from there, all creation follows. To honor this act of creation, pharaohs had to routinely engage in a fertility ritual that would ensure their land remained rich and their crops bountiful. To do this, pharaohs, who remember, were nearly all very obese, had to shuffle down to the banks of the Nile and, well, recreate the Atum act in the water. The Egyptians saw this as a powerful act of symbolism, and in fact, the ancient Egyptian word for progeny and the floods of the Nile were all the same word, matut.